My name is Josh Johnson. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a data architect on the UTO Data Intelligence team. As soon as I got to UTO 4 months ago, Mike was like, hey, we've got the Zoom data. Let's do something with it. So been working on that kind of off and on for a few months now. I was really hoping when I submitted the proposal for this presentation that there'd be, lots of data in the warehouse and we could kind of go through that and you guys would be able to go in there and start using it. We're not quite there. So I'm going to talk a little about the status of this whole process along with the design. So we're going to talk about data acquisition, the raw tables that we're getting from Zoom, essentially, the enrichment process that we're applying to the data and what tables are being generated from that, and talk a little bit about some very early findings from use of the data, and talk about future use and what we're hoping to do with it, and then also documentation that's available or will be available in some cases. All right, so DAC. These are essentially the stages to getting the raw data into the warehouse. So Zoom offers an API interface. The data engineers have been developing a Python script, or series of Python scripts, I should say, that run each day in order to pull down the previous day's worth of data from the Zoom API. Once that's done, they'll be putting that data into S3, where the warehouse team will pick it up and copy it over into Redshift. And then they will create a Matillion job to apply the enrichment logic and create those enriched tables also within Redshift. So the API, so like I mentioned, this is offered by Zoom. They have pretty thorough documentation out there. If you're ever interested in what else might be available, feel free to visit. There's a lot. I've gone through most of it. A lot of the API is really intended for management and maintenance of the Zoom platform itself, not necessarily pulling data out for analytics. So we've started with 3 different endpoints, and these probably capture almost everything we're going to need for most of our currently expected use cases. So we've got meeting level data, we've got meeting participant level data, and then we've got user level data. And so the relationships kind of between these, a user can be a meeting host or a meeting participant.
Gonna shrink at least.
And then participants attend the meetings. So all these are different granularities, but there are some kind of almost explicit relationships between them. All right, so within the API, the time is UTC, which means midnight in the Zoom data is approximately 5 p.m. in Phoenix. And that is kind of driving how we schedule the data pulls, because you pull it by a Zoom day, not by a local day. Talk about that a little bit. It delivers on the user's API only the current values. So if something has changed since yesterday, there's no way to pull what changed. You just pull, these are what the users are right now. That. Whereas with the meetings and participants, you pull one day at a time. So we actually get additions daily rather than having to load everything, because there are limits on the API. And the engineers have put a lot of effort into trying to work around those limits, because I'm not sure if anyone's seen the dashboard, the Zoom dashboard, but we have a lot of Zoom data. There's a lot of people at ASU using Zoom. All right, so additional considerations within the API, there's also this users meetings endpoint, it's not that different than the meetings endpoint that we're already using. The big change is that this only includes meetings which were scheduled ahead of time within Zoom. So if you just popped open a meeting in your personal meeting room, it's not really captured here. The benefit is it actually has the Zoom user ID in it, whereas the regular meetings don't. And so I'm going to talk probably quite a bit about the challenges in using this data because of a lack of identifiers that are consistent across different repositories. So just having that user ID and a meeting ID in the same table could provide us benefits in making connections within the data. And then some of you, especially you who might work with faculty or classes in the colleges, are probably familiar with the MyASU customizations that have been done. So there's kind of a little platform within MyASU that allows instructors or colleges to go in and specify what room they want to use for an instructor or for a class. And that will overwrite whatever the default is in some cases. And it can even take precedence over data captured in PeopleSoft about what class should have Zoom meetings. So there's information here that's likely going to be valuable down the road, but this is still pretty new. All right, so in Python, as I mentioned, midnight 5 p.m. here, we had some issues that we thought might have related to timing. So we're kicking off these jobs around 7 p.m. It returns a JSON file, which I know I wouldn't want to play with. So I'm glad the warehouse team's taking care of that. And they're adding in the date that they use, because if you look at some of these endpoints that are listed, for instance, this one here, you have to actually specify the meeting ID to get the participant list. And for both of these, you also have to specify a date that you want. So that data is inherent to the API data, but it's not explicit. So the developers are adding these into the data so that we have them for reference as well. All right, so current challenges, like I mentioned, we're still dealing with these API limits. We're also finding some weird patterns where some records just don't get returned each day, but if we go back later and try to pull it again, they will be. So trying to figure out what that is, we think it might be something on the Zoom side with their data storage processes, because the database we're hitting is almost certainly not their operational database. So there might be some latency within their processing that we need to account for. And then if there are some really, really specific features that you can use within Zoom, and if nobody used those within a day, they just don't show up in the data, and that causes some things to break on our side with the processing. And then we're just getting some weird errors because of HTTP request encryption and things like that. So there's some things we're still working around. It's getting really close, but this is ultimately what we're trying to strive for as part of phase 1. So we're going to be, like I said, using Redshift. It's going to be an ASU learning schema. Sheila Ainley is the data steward. And we're going to have one table for each of those endpoints, because all we're doing is recording that raw data plus the data elements required for the API calls. So meeting level data, meeting participant level data, user level data. And as I mentioned, we might be adding a couple based on that additional endpoint to get a meeting ID and a user ID in the same place, and the MyASU data to see what's been overwritten. Now, these are raw tables. Really not very usable without a lot of post-processing. So we're developing state encryption. That looks like this. So we take our meeting host information and we're joining it to PeopleSoft instructors. We're taking our meeting participant data and matching it to PeopleSoft students. I should say this is very student focused right now, but at some point we will be doing this for just anyone at ASU, because as I will mention later on, we have some non-student class use cases that we're going to have to account for. But all we're doing is we're taking identifiers within PeopleSoft and trying to match them to identifiers within Zoom. Between the two platforms, there's 6 different ways to join on email address between the two platforms. So we're just doing all of them and hoping we get at least one match. So far, if we get one match, all the other matches we might get from different combinations of email addresses all point to the same person. So we have yet to get 2 different people from PeopleSoft matched to a single person from Zoom, or 2 different Zoom people matched to a single person from PeopleSoft. But we will be developing processes to deal with that should it happen, because within all this data, kind of the overarching theme is ambiguity. Nothing in here is perfect. And then it talks more about challenges, but we're hoping to create elements within the data that try to estimate how reliable each data point is based on what we had to do to make it work. So once we've done all that and tried to match people together on email addresses between the 2 systems, and if we get them IASU, it won't just be email addresses. We'll also have some Zoom links that we can use, things like that. We take the meeting data and the participant data that we've gotten here, make one data set, and we actually pull class meeting schedules for students from PeopleSoft. So if I'm taking 2 classes and each of those classes meets 4 days a week, I will have 4 records per week. I think that math was done that. So every single time we expect a student to be in a sync class, and that's kind of important here, the sync aspect of it. You don't necessarily expect a Zoom meeting for a class that's supposed to be 100% in person or 100% online, because those modalities don't encourage or potentially even allow for a Zoom meeting to happen. So sync class schedules. And then we try to match those together. So we already have potentially a student ID on that class schedule, and hopefully we match that student ID to the participant information using their email address. And so now what we're trying to do is figure out which of these meetings were for which classes. And so there's, again, matching on IDs, but we also have timing to consider. So right now we're looking at something like the Zoom meeting must have started about 15 minutes before the class was scheduled to start. If it's more than 15 minutes before, we're saying, that meeting might have been for something else. And if it starts more than or less than 15 minutes before the end of the class, so you started a meeting right before class ends, probably for something else. So we're making a lot of assumptions, not just based on these identifiers, but also based on start and end times of classes and meetings. A lot of these we know aren't valid, especially with the early data. We, just kind of manually going through and reviewing the data, we found that some classes were starting their Zoom meetings like hours before the class was scheduled to start, just to test out all their settings and stuff like that. And also going to talk a little bit about some of the other challenges of that. But once we've joined all that together, we can start creating our actual enriched tables. Those enriched tables are going to be much more useful because they have these IDs. They've been connected already. So the challenges with enrichment. If everyone was authenticated, everyone would have an actual Zoom user value, and we'd have their actual ASU right email address. And so we have a very reliable identifier. Not perfectly reliable because email addresses change, and like I mentioned, the Zoom data doesn't have history for users. But most people aren't authenticated. I don't want to say most. A lot of people aren't authenticated when they join a meeting. you can just open up Zoom, type in your name, type in an email address, whatever you want, and boom, you're in, unless there's a meeting room and they say no. Waiting room. Now, another challenge we have is meetings can be stopped and restarted. So again, trying to match on timing is a challenge, because right now, Carter could stop this meeting, start it back up, and it's kind of the same, but it's recorded as a separate meeting within the data. So every time you stop and restart, it's a new record. And so there's issues with timing there, but also the granularity of the data. It makes it less usable. Talk a little bit about that. And then not only can the meeting be stopped and restarted, but any of you right now could jump out, go check out something else, and then be like, oh, that stuff Josh was doing was pretty cool, and come back. And that's, again, 2 records for the same participant in the same meeting. So there's challenges with both of those. Academic challenges. My ASU tries to address this first one, right? Saying this is the Zoom room that's supposed to be used for this class. That data doesn't really exist anywhere. Definitely not anything close to complete. So there's challenges. If we use something similar to the Canvas logic, where you have a predefined identifier within Canvas for a class, this wouldn't really be a problem. We'd know exactly what meetings for which class. I talked about starting before and after, and then I don't know how, but students can actually register to take classes, multiple classes at the exact same time, and instructors can be scheduled to teach multiple classes at the exact same time. It's primarily a grad level class thing, and I think a lot of it's the kind of generic classes like thesis defense. But it causes problems because now, even if we make all these joins and everything looks good, we don't know which one it's for just because it's not unique within PeopleSoft. So there's some issues there. A lot of this is based on email address matching. Within the warehouse, we only have current email addresses. So all that historical data, if we ever go and try to update it, isn't really an option. I mentioned the users table doesn't have history. We are at some point going to try to address that by capturing the history on our side. And the way you join a user to a meeting in Zoom, you can try to use email address. You can try to use user ID, but oftentimes it's the personal meeting room ID. So if you have a recurring room that you just use for whatever, that's a good way to make that connection, but you can always go and change that whenever you want. And so again, lack of history. And for anyone who just watched the Actionable Analytics project, you'll know history is important for analytics.
Hey, Josh.
So after all this enrichment happens, what are we trying to get out of it? Well, maybe we'll create something to clean up the Zoom data, right? So I talked about meetings and participants, stopping, starting, leaving, joining. We might create a process that aggregates those and tries to create one record per functional meeting, one record per functional participant. And that can then make analytics downstream much easier. But primarily what we're going to be doing is joining the PeopleSoft data to the Zoom data, right? So we've got our 3 core tables here. We've got all these tables in PeopleSoft that we use to make these connections. And all these inverse tables also in ASU Learning. So if we start with the Zoom data and we bring in PeopleSoft data, this is what we can do, right? So we still have those 3 granularities: user, meeting, meeting participant. But what we're doing is all those email joins, all those timing joins, and bringing in ASU identifiers into the Zoom data. That way, if someone wants to go out there and use the Zoom data, those identifiers are there, they easily connect it to whatever they want, instead of having to recreate all that logic in their set. With users that might, there's probably going to be their EMPL ID, their ASU right ID, but we also want to aggregate data and make these kind of pre-processed analytics as well. So how many meetings has this user hosted? How many meetings have they attended? We can do things like this, which can save on downstream processing, expedite analytics, expedite analysis. How many participants attended a Zoom meeting? Zoom provides us with a participant count, but then if you go and look at the participant data and you count them, it doesn't match. The Zoom provides us with a meeting duration, but if you look at the start and end times, it doesn't match. So we're kind of recreating the wheel in some of these cases, but ensuring that the data we're presenting is as accurate as it can be. And then with the meetings also, if it's a class, adding class ID. Meeting participants, student IDs, some of the aggregations that you might see at that level is a little bit harder because there's not a lot of information that comes across at that level in any system. So that would be mostly just joining the data together. We can go in the other direction and we can say, okay, we're going to start with PeopleSoft data and we're going to bring in Zoom data. And so here we're looking at, well, we've got this schedule of classes in PeopleSoft. If there's a Zoom meeting that got tied to this in this enrichment process, well, let's just put that Zoom meeting out there. And now people know, oh, hey, there was a Zoom meeting for this. Now, if you're doing sync classes, that allows you to do things like the number of students who attended that sync class via Zoom, or potentially even the percent of students who attended that class via Zoom. And you can relate that to how many students were enrolled for this class session at the time. So it's allowing us, again, to create the analytic layer by joining the data together. And there's a class schedule, but there's also the student class schedule. So this class meets Monday, Wednesday, Friday, but there's also 50 students in that class. So each of those students should be there Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And we might want to know how engaged are those students within the Zoom modality. And so we can make those connections. We can create that data and allow for that type of analysis. And kind of taking away from students, well, maybe we want to do some instructor evaluation. We can look at where was an instructor scheduled to be. Was there a Zoom meeting for this class or not? Did they share their screen? Did they record it potentially for future use? So there's some metrics we can create around instructors as well. Then we can take that, the enriched PeopleSoft data, the enriched Zoom data, and aggregate it further. So this is how we create context for analysis. So one of the items that has come up so far is student level. So they want to know, just like we know when a student last had some sort of activity in Canvas, we want to know when did they last attend a class, because that might actually be more recent. And if you're looking for students who aren't engaged within a class, they might not have any LMS activity for a week. But if they attended class every day that week, they're engaged. So this is that supplemental engagement data that can support that type of analysis for interventions. We can also create context around class level data. So approximately how many percent of students have attended this class, this sync class via Zoom. Obviously, we don't have in-class participation to compare it to, but you can look for classes which might have almost entirely Zoom participation or almost no Zoom participation. And you can use that for policy evaluation. You can use that for other types of analytics as well. So class level, student level, interact those student within a class. What percent of the meetings of this class in general did they attend, right? And that could then be fed into something like a predictive model for attrition, retention. Instructor within a class, instructor level. If you want to do instructor evaluation, that's obviously a sensitive topic, so it might not happen. All right, so this is kind of what we want to do at this point in time. Here's what's been done so far with the data that's roughly been created. So you can go to uto.asu.edu/key-data, and we have a dashboard out there that'll tell you how many meetings we've had each day, meeting number of minutes per meeting for the day, meeting number of participants per meeting for the day. And it's broken out between what we've been able to tie to a class and what we couldn't tie to a class. And so you can look for patterns there. We've got these, high-level aggregates. I think it's sad that we've, in general, spent more than 3,000 years in Zoom across the university. And I think this is like 2 months old. But we've also done some class level analysis using some of those enriched data sets that I was talking about. Again, they're not in the warehouse, but as we've been developing them, we've been playing with them, evaluating them, because that's a good way to test them. And so we look at all the sync eligible classes and we see, oh, the percent of those classes that have used Zoom is roughly flat over this week. This was the first week of classes for fall. Maybe a little increase, and then we look at sync only, and this was definitely flat. So when you think about this, sync only means all the students should be on Zoom. So if only 70% of the classes have a Zoom, we can then assume that our match rate for Zoom to PeopleSoft at the class level is about 70%. Because if we had 100% match rate, 100% of the sync only classes should be using Zoom. So we can use that to try to identify how accurate it is. Then we can look at the number of students that are in Zoom, or the percent of students for the class who are using Zoom. And that we can see is actually trending up. So during that first week of classes, students started out maybe going more in person, and then they're like, let's try this Zoom thing. And so the sync modality became more popular over that first week. So we can do trending analysis like this. We can do accuracy analysis like this. But what we really want to do, and then I've got a couple of different options here. So within actionable analytics, we have predictive models. And so we can potentially use this class attendance information to predict student performance. So it might be retention, it might be whether they're going to pass a class, or they're going to drop a class. This can be predictive. We don't know that it is, we haven't tried it, but we can test it. And for Campaign Builder, if someone wants to, again, identify those students who aren't engaged, they haven't had any LMS activity, or they haven't attended a Zoom class in the last week, we want to use this data to allow people to outreach to students based on that information. Outside of actionable analytics, so there's been discussion, there's been requests, I believe, from the colleges to try to incorporate this into the dashboards they already have. But there's also been discussion around using it to evaluate actual business meetings. So we're pulling all of the Zoom data for all the RWUG meetings, for instance, over the last 8 months, and trying to figure out, has attendance been increasing, decreasing? Are people coming regularly, or is it very infrequent? That type of information. Who's showing up? And finally, documentation. So obviously, ASU data documentation, long way to go, and this is no exception. But I think we're off to a pretty good start. So obviously, as I mentioned, the Zoom API, very detailed, very thorough. That's always out there. We have internal process documentation. That looks kind of like this. So this capturing the process from start to finish, what's happening along the way, details about all that. So source, endpoints, if you don't want to go to Zoom documentation, it's all copied here. Possible endpoints, my ASU, information about that data source, the processing that's occurring versus what's going to be changing, what's in the warehouse now, what's going to be in the warehouse next. And we have, again, it's pretty much the Zoom documentation for the raw tables. Things we're adding, changing, future plans, concerns, information we're using from PeopleSoft to do the joins, the tables that we're looking to build in the enriched space, along with definitions for all those fields, and then information about how we're doing the joins, what information is being used, how it's being processed. And yeah, that's that document. Eventually, we'll have all the data definitions within Calibra for all the tables. As of right now, I don't think a whole lot in this Google Sheet. Most of it's been done within that doc so far. But we'll be filling this out, then eventually migrating to Calibra. And we're also going to be creating some ERDs. So yeah, you can know what's in the data and you can know where it's located, but this will help with things like how to actually join it together, because it's not always intuitive. And what I'm hoping to do is add in some context around how to join together when it comes to things like, why would you do this? Or why would you not do something else? For additional information, additional insight. All right. Anyone have questions, comments? Anyone have any plans for Zoom data once they can get their hands on it?
A couple questions in the chat, Josh. I'll go first because I have one of them in there. So given that we don't have 100% match to the users because there's some wiggle room in there, what do you think our percent matches? If we had a Zoom meeting with 100 users in it, how many of those 100 in general do you think we can identify in our system?
I think users, it really depends on the type of meeting. Meetings with lots of students, I think, tend to be less authenticated than meetings with lots of business users. Something like this, right here, right now, it's probably at least 90%.
But a student session, is it like 80%?
I'm really curious. I haven't looked into it. I want to find a good example of a student club meeting or something like that, where it's all students, it's not formal, there's no instructor forcing any sort of policy, and trying to get a better idea based on that type of an event. But I haven't actually checked it out.
Got it. Thank you.
Once we get into like the class meetings, that's at 80%. Some of that is because of the timing, though. It's not just the user identification, right? Some of those we could identify the user, but it didn't look like the right class. So even students might be in the 90% range in a scenario like that, where some of the instructors might be forcing authentication.
But we're not in the 50% range. That's in general.
I doubt it.
Right.
Okay, so is the API open to anyone who wants to access data in their Zoom meetings? The API is not. We are restricted to one set of API keys, and as you can imagine, UTO is holding those close, because if they get out, we're in all kinds of trouble. But we definitely want to make it so that if you have a need for the data, you'll still be able to access it in the warehouse, even if you can't get it through the API directly. Matching Salesforce data to Zoom meetings with future students you're presenting to. So that's not something that's come up yet. So that's one of those potential future uses for sure. If you have a use case like that, the data you need will be there. The complexity is going to be, again, we might have matched the IDs, but if we're matching IDs, it's on existing students. It has to be someone who has actually applied, because they have to have an EMPL ID, an ASU Right ID. If it's just a prospect, all that matching isn't going to accomplish anything. So we'd have to actually look into the Salesforce contact information and try to recreate that matching logic using the Salesforce data. And
Josh,
then
on that, correct me if I'm wrong, but if we did a Zoom meeting for high school seniors, said, hey, come check it out, all they're doing is typing their name, which could be Joe or Sally, right? I mean, we have very little to go on for identifying them.
You have to have a name and an email address in order to get in. So there's a chance that email address they give us for the Zoom meeting will be the same one they gave us that we recorded in Salesforce. There's also algorithms that are used within Salesforce for name matching. And Michael over at Plus has actually recreated that outside of Salesforce. So if you want to try doing name matching, we do have that option. It is pretty complicated, but it could be useful in situations like this. The other thing I'd say with the use case like that is, when you set up the meeting, you're going to want to at least record that link. Like, what was the meeting URL? Because you need to be able to identify the meeting before you can try to identify the participants. So if you have maybe a custom URL, that's always useful, because then you can just do a text search. But worst case scenario, try to record those in a Google Sheet or something you can later reference. How can Zoom dialogue transcript data be used in the future if verbal to text algorithms improve within Zoom? Yeah, so the speech to text right now, I've been kind of watching it throughout the conference, and it's good. It's not great, for sure, especially with words and phrases that aren't common. And obviously acronyms are terrible. But I want to say, I looked at this at some place, I don't think the actual text is available through the API. It might just be somewhere in the API I haven't looked, but I don't remember seeing that. It would be interesting, especially for like class interactions. But I also don't think it makes any attempt to identify the speaker. So if you want to do something like, did the student speak during the class session? I don't think that's going to be an option at all. I know if I host one and I turn the transcript on, it just saves it to a local file automatically. Or if I even participate in one, sometimes it saves it to a local file. I don't know if it's available through the API. There's a link there if you want to go check it out. Do the data include who speaks for how long? So I don't think so. It's pretty limited as far as that kind of information. Let me actually pull something up really quick.
Isn't there a binary? Did the user turn their mic on or not?
I'm gonna pull up what we have, and you can take a look. Oh, come on. Here we go. Here. So, start the meetings. So within the meeting level information, you get things like whether screen share was used in general, whether it was recorded or not. That's about the only interesting stuff you get that I would actually trust from this, because I don't trust duration or participants. I don't even know what half this other stuff is, so it's probably not that important. Once you get into the participant data, you can get IP address and location. Location appears to be parsed from an IP address, assuming using a Google service or something, but it's not super accurate. I was talking with someone in Ed Plus, and it had her joining one meeting from Peoria, where she lives, and then half an hour later, she was in San Jose. And then a half hour after that, she was in a city I've never heard of. And then she was back to Peoria. So there are some challenges with IP and location for sure. And it doesn't appear to be a VPN thing, which makes it even weirder. So it's got to be an internet host issue or something. It might be routing. It will tell you the type of microphone someone uses, the type of camera they're using. It will tell you if they shared something, whether it's an application, their general desktop, or the whiteboard. And again, was recording used for the meeting in general? It will tell you the name of their PC. It'll give you their MAC address. But you'll notice in here, nowhere does it tell you if they unmuted themselves, if they shared their screen. All that stuff you'd really want to know isn't included, unfortunately. Now, I will say there's a lot of activity in the Zoom API. They do seem to be adding features fairly regularly. So there's no guarantee that they won't add it in the future. But there might be some security sensitivity, data use agreement issues that they just can't get past to make that happen. Who knows? Certainly the data exists. It's just not in the API. Unless it's just in a different endpoint that I haven't seen. All right. Any other questions? I'm really curious for more use cases. I like that Salesforce one. Oh, Maria, you said you're manually importing the Zoom meeting attendees into Salesforce. How do you know who the attendees are? Do you have someone?
We're given the list. So when the recruiters do events, Zoom events, they submit their list and then we import them. Yeah, we're waiting for an API. We're waiting for an API to be able to, but at this time, I don't think there's anything that we can use besides doing just this manual list pulls and sends and imports.
Yeah. So there are meeting host tools. So you can go in after your meeting and export a list of participants. I don't know what else is available that way. I've never really looked at it. I'm not sure there's anything more detailed, but yeah, we should probably, once this data is out there, get some time with Roger Davies and start talking about automating that Salesforce import. The key again is going to be those URLs, knowing which meetings to get a list of participants for. So that's going to be crucial.
Right. The other thing we have is just trying to have them set up their data. I guess they have a template when they set up their meetings, and just making sure it's consistent so that if we do have some kind of import or API call, that everything's the same.
That's definitely a good start. I mean, step one to any integration is having consistent data. Anyone else? Rest of y'all are just curious as to what Zoom data is doing.
Great info, Josh. Thanks.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for attending and getting some stuff going in the chat there. And I hope you all enjoy the rest of the conference.